What happens when five armed men think they've found an easy target, only to discover they've just made the biggest mistake of their lives? Sometimes, the person who looks most vulnerable is actually the most dangerous person in the room. The rain hammered against the windows of the abandoned warehouse like angry fists, each drop echoing through the empty corridors of what used to be Chicago's largest textile factory. Sarah Martinez pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders as she navigated through the maze of broken machinery and scattered debris. At 5'4", with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she looked like any other middle-aged woman trying to find shelter from the storm. She had been walking home from her job at the local diner when the weather turned violent. The shortcut through the old industrial district usually saved her 20 minutes, but tonight it might save her from getting completely soaked. Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous path could also be the safest, depending on who you were and what you knew. The warehouse had been empty for 3 years, ever since the company moved their operations overseas. Local teenagers sometimes used it as a hangout spot, but on a night like this, Sarah expected to have the place to herself. She found a relatively dry corner near what used to be the main production floor and sat down on an old wooden crate, pulling out her phone to check the weather app. That's when she heard the footsteps. 5 men emerged from the shadows like predators who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They moved with the confident swagger of people who had done this many times before, their eyes already calculating the value of whatever they might find in her purse. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, stepped forward with a smile that held no warmth. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Looks like someone's lost." Sarah looked up slowly, her dark eyes taking in each man's position, noting their body language, their weapons, their likely experience level. The leader carried a switchblade, keeping it visible but not yet threatening. 2 of his companions had baseball bats, while the other 2 relied on their size and the intimidation factor of being in a group, just waiting for the rain to stop. Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the situation. She had learned decades ago that showing fear too early could escalate things unnecessarily. The man with the scar laughed a harsh sound that bounced off the empty walls. "This is our place, lady. You want shelter, you pay rent." Sarah slowly stood up, keeping her movements non-threatening. "I don't want any trouble. I'll just leave." "Not so fast," another man said, stepping to block her path to the exit. He was younger than the leader, maybe in his 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that made him more dangerous than the others. "You didn't pay the entrance fee either." The 5 men began to circle her, their formation practiced and efficient. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. They had done this before, probably many times. They would surround their victim, create fear through intimidation, take whatever they wanted, and then escalate to violence if the person resisted, or if they simply felt like it. "Look," Sarah said, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket. "I have some money. Not much, but you can have it." She pulled out a worn wallet and opened it, showing them the few $20 bills inside. It was a deliberate move, designed to make them think she was complying while also letting her assess their reactions and positions more accurately. The leader snatched the wallet from her hands and counted the money quickly. $60? That's it? His voice rose with artificial outrage. "You think $60 covers the inconvenience of having to deal with you?" Sarah had been in situations like this more times than she cared to remember, though usually from a very different perspective. During her 20 years in the Navy SEALs, she had often been the one doing the hunting, tracking down targets in hostile territory where one mistake could mean death for her entire team. "That's all I have," she said simply. The youngest member of the group suddenly grabbed her shoulder roughly. "Maybe she's got more hidden somewhere. We should check." That was the moment Sarah knew this situation was about to escalate beyond simple robbery. The way he grabbed her, the look in his eyes, the murmurs of agreement from the others all told her that these men had decided she was going to be more than just a victim of theft. "Please," she said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice for the first time. "Just take the money and let me go." The leader smiled wider, interpreting her fear as weakness. It was a mistake that had gotten a lot of bad people killed over the years, but he had no way of knowing that. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, stepping closer. "You're going to come with us up to the roof. We're going to have a little conversation about where you might have more valuables stashed. And then, well, we'll see how cooperative you've been." 2 of the men moved to grab her arms, but Sarah stepped back, raising her hands in what appeared to be surrender. Wait. There might be something else." She reached into her other jacket pocket, her movements slow and deliberate. The men relaxed slightly, thinking she was about to produce more money or jewelry. Instead, her fingers found the small tactical knife she always carried, a habit from her military days that she had never been able to break, but she didn't draw it. Not yet. "I have a watch," she said, rolling up her sleeve to show them a simple digital timepiece. "It's not worth much, but you can have it." The leader looked at the cheap watch with disgust. "You're wasting our time, lady. Move." They forced her toward the metal staircase that led to the building's upper levels. The stairs were rusty and some of the steps were missing, making the climb treacherous in the dim light filtering in through broken windows. Sarah climbed carefully, very aware of the men behind her and the long drop to the concrete floor below. As they ascended, Sarah's mind automatically shifted into tactical assessment mode. The warehouse had 4 floors plus the roof access. The staircase was external to the main building structure, attached to the outside wall with metal brackets that showed signs of corrosion. The roof itself would be flat, probably with various vents and mechanical equipment that could provide cover or be used as weapons. More importantly, at this height and with this much open space, the men's numerical advantage would be less significant. In close quarters, they could overwhelm her through sheer numbers, but on a rooftop, with room to move and multiple escape routes, the dynamic would be very different. They reached the roof access door, which hung open on broken hinges. The leader pushed Sarah through first, and she stepped out into the driving rain. The rooftop was exactly as she had pictured it. Flat, with several large ventilation units, a small structure that housed the stair access, and a low concrete barrier around the perimeter. The wind was stronger up here, whipping the rain sideways and making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and moved toward the center of the roof, away from the edge. "This is perfect," the leader said, having to raise his voice over the wind. "Nice and private. No one's going to hear anything up here." The 5 men spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off her routes back to the stair access. Sarah turned slowly, keeping all of them in her peripheral vision while appearing to focus on the leader. "Look, I've told you I don't have anything else," she said. "Please, just let me go." "See, that's where you're wrong. You do have something else. You just don't realize it yet." One of the men with baseball bats stepped forward. "Maybe we should help her remember." Sarah continued to back away from them, moving closer to the roof's edge. To the men, it looked like she was being driven into a corner with no escape. What they didn't realize was that she was deliberately positioning herself exactly where she wanted to be. "Please," she said again, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I have a daughter, she's waiting for me at home." This was a lie, but it was the kind of detail that might make them hesitate, might make them think twice about what they were planning to do. Some criminals, even violent ones, drew lines they wouldn't cross. These men weren't some of those criminals. "Should have thought about that before you came into our territory," the leader said. He nodded to 2 of his companions. "Grab her." The 2 men moved forward simultaneously, one from each side. Sarah appeared to panic, stumbling backward toward the roof's edge. Her foot slipped on the wet concrete and she went down hard, landing near the low barrier that was all that stood between her and a 4-story drop to the alley below. "Careful there," the leader called out mockingly. "Wouldn't want you to fall before we're done with our conversation." Sarah scrambled backward on her hands and knees, apparently trying to get away from the approaching men. The concrete barrier was only about 18 inches high, and in her apparent panic, she pressed herself against it. "Nowhere to run now," one of the bat-wielding men said with satisfaction. Sarah looked up at them with what appeared to be pure terror in her eyes. "Please don't hurt me. I'll do whatever you want." The leader's smile turned cruel. "Now that's more like it. But you know what? I think you've caused us enough trouble already. Maybe it's time for you to learn what happens to people who waste our time." He nodded to the others, and suddenly all 5 men rushed toward her at once. That was when Sarah Martinez stopped pretending to be a helpless victim. Her first move was simple but devastating. As the closest man reached for her, she rolled to her left and swept his legs with a precise kick that sent him tumbling over the low barrier. His scream was cut short by the sound of impact 4 stories below. The other 4 men stopped in shock, not quite processing what had just happened. Sarah used their moment of confusion to spring to her feet with a fluid motion that spoke of years of combat training. "What the hell?" the leader started to say. Sarah's tactical knife appeared in her hand as if by magic, the blade catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. She held it in a reverse grip, the way she had been trained to fight in close quarters, where every movement needed to be economical and lethal. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice completely different now, calm, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. "You've made a very serious mistake." The transformation was so complete that for a moment, The four remaining men couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The frightened middle-aged woman was gone, replaced by someone whose very posture radiated lethal competence. You killed Jimmy," one of them stammered. Sarah tilted her head slightly, considering this. "Jimmy made a choice. You're all about to make choices too. Choose wisely." The leader raised his switchblade, trying to regain control of the situation. "There's 4 of us and 1 of you, lady. Whatever game you're playing, it's over." Sarah smiled, and it was expression that had once struck fear into the hearts of terrorists in 3 different countries. 4 of you, 1 of me, on a rooftop in a storm, with nowhere to run and no backup coming. She shifted into a combat stance. "Those sound like pretty good odds." For me, the rain continued to pound the rooftop, creating a natural sound barrier that would mask whatever happened next. Sarah kept her knife low and her center of gravity balanced, her feet positioned for maximum mobility on the slick concrete surface. The 4 remaining men had spread out again, but their formation was no longer confident and predatory. Now they moved with the uncertainty of people who had suddenly realized they might be the prey. The leader tried to reassert his authority, raising his switchblade higher. "I don't know what kind of martial arts class you took, lady, but this isn't a movie. You get lucky once, fine, but you're not walking away from 4 of us." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she was cataloging everything about her opponents. Their stance, their grip on their weapons, their breathing patterns, which foot they favored, how they reacted to movement in their peripheral vision. It was an automatic process honed by years of life or death situations where reading an enemy correctly was the difference between coming home and being shipped back in a flag-draped coffin. The youngest one, the one who had grabbed her shoulder downstairs, was breathing too fast and gripping his baseball bat too tightly. He would swing wild and leave himself open. The heavy-set man to her left kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit that would telegraph his movements. The leader was trying to look calm, but his knife hand had a barely perceptible tremor. Only one of them, a wiry man with grey streaks in his hair, seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. He held his bat properly, kept his breathing controlled, and moved with the careful economy of someone who had been in real fights before. He would be the most dangerous, which meant he would have to be dealt with first. "Last chance to walk away," Sarah said quietly. "Drop your weapons, go back downstairs, and pretend this never happened." The leader laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think because you pushed Jimmy off the roof, we're going to run? He was careless. We're not." "Jimmy didn't fall," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "I threw him. There's a difference." The casual way she said it, as if discussing the weather, sent a visible chill through the group. The youngest one actually took a step backward. "She's bluffing," the leader said, more to reassure himself than the others. "She got lucky with the sucker punch. 4 on 1, we end this now." He raised his hand to signal an attack, but Sarah was already moving. 20 years of Navy SEAL training had taught her that, in multiple opponent situations, speed and aggression were more important than technique. The goal wasn't to win a fair fight. It was to eliminate threats as quickly as possible while minimizing damage to yourself. She went for the experienced one first, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick steps, while his attention was focused on the leader's signal. Her knife hand came up in a precise arc, but instead of going for a killing blow, she sliced across his knuckles. The baseball bat clattered to the wet concrete as his fingers reflexively opened, and a sharp elbow to his solar plexus sent him gasping to his knees. The whole exchange took less than 2 seconds. The other 3 were still reacting to her movement when she pivoted and launched herself at the nervous heavy man. He swung his bat in a wide, clumsy arc that she easily ducked under. Her shoulder hit him in the midsection with the force of a linebacker's tackle, and they both went down hard on the slick rooftop. Sarah rolled away immediately, coming to her feet just as the young one finally worked up the courage to attack. His swing was exactly as wild as she had predicted, and she simply stepped inside his reach, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling toward the roof's edge. Unlike his friend Jimmy, she didn't let him go over. Instead, she yanked him back at the last second, but not before he got a very clear look at the 4-story drop that awaited him. The psychological impact was devastating. His bat fell from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to his knees, hyperventilating. That left just the leader. He had watched his 3 companions get neutralized in under 10 seconds, and the cocky confidence was completely gone now. His switchblade shook in his hand as he backed away from her. "What are you?" he whispered. Sarah picked up one of the dropped baseball bats, testing its weight and balance. It was aluminum, well used but solid. Not her preferred weapon, but it would do. My name is Sarah Martinez, she said calmly. I served 20 years in the United States Navy SEALs. I have more confirmed kills than you have fingers and toes. I've operated in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and half a dozen other places that officially don't exist in any mission reports. She began to advance on him slowly, the bat held casually in one hand. I've fought my way out of situations that would give you nightmares. I've survived things that killed better men than you. And tonight, I was just trying to get home from work without getting soaked. The leader's back hit the ventilation unit behind him. There was nowhere left to retreat. Women can't be SEALs, he stammered. Sarah smiled coldly. You're right. Officially, women couldn't serve in direct combat roles until 2013. But there were always ways around that for people with the right skills and the right connections. Special Operations doesn't care about your gender if you can do the job. She was close enough now that she could have ended the fight with a single swing of the bat. Instead, she stopped just out of his reach. Here's what's going to happen, she said. You're going to help me get your friend's medical attention. Then you're going to disappear from this neighborhood and never come back. Because if I see you again, if I even hear about you causing problems in this area, I will find you. And next time, I won't be in such a forgiving mood. The man nodded frantically. Yes, okay. We'll leave. We'll never come back. Sarah studied his face for a moment, reading his sincerity. Fear was a powerful motivator, but it didn't always last. Some people needed a more permanent reminder. She swung the bat in a lightning-fast arc that stopped just inches from his head, close enough that he could feel the displacement of air. The sound it made cutting through the rain was like a sword slash. I want you to remember that feeling, she said quietly. That's how close you just came to dying. Every time you think about coming back here, every time you consider hurting someone who can't defend themselves, remember that feeling. The leader slumped against the ventilation unit, his legs no longer able to support him. Sarah turned her attention to the other three men. The experienced fighter was still on his knees, clutching his injured hand. The cut wasn't deep enough to cause permanent damage, but it would need stitches. The heavy man was conscious but clearly had the wind knocked out of him. The young one was sitting in a puddle, staring at the roof's edge with wide, traumatized eyes. You, she said, pointing to the leader. Call 911. Tell them there's been an accident at the old textile warehouse. One man fell from the roof. 3 others are injured. When the police ask what happened, you tell them it was dark, you were drinking, and Jimmy slipped on the wet concrete. But that's the story, Sarah said firmly. Any other version of events ends badly for you. Understand? He nodded quickly. Sarah walked over to the young man and crouched down beside him. Up close, she could see he was probably no more than 19 or 20 years old. Old enough to make adult decisions, but still young enough that those decisions hadn't completely defined who he was yet. What's your name? She asked. Marcus, he stammered. Marcus, look at me. She waited until he met her eyes. This doesn't have to be who you are. You can make different choices. Better choices. But if you keep running with people like this, keep hurting innocent people, eventually you're going to run into someone like me when I'm having a worse day. She stood up and looked at all 4 of them. Jimmy's dead because he chose to put his hands on someone without knowing who he was dealing with. The rest of you are alive because I chose mercy tonight. Don't make me regret that choice. The leader was fumbling with his phone, trying to dial 911 with shaking hands. Sarah waited until she heard him start talking to the emergency dispatcher, confirming that he was sticking to the story she had given him. Satisfied that they would handle the immediate situation, Sarah walked back toward the stair access. She paused at the doorway and looked back at them one more time. One more thing, she said. If any of you ever tell anyone about what really happened here tonight, if you ever mention my name or describe me to anyone, I will find out. And I will find you. She disappeared into the stairwell, leaving the 4 men alone with their fear and the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. As Sarah made her way down the rusty stairs, she felt the familiar mixture of adrenaline calm down and professional satisfaction that followed any successful operation. The threat had been neutralized, collateral damage had been minimized, and the tactical objectives had been achieved. But there was something else. Something she hadn't felt in the years since she had left the Navy. A sense of purpose. For too long, she had been just another veteran trying to adjust to civilian life, working dead-end jobs and struggling to find meaning in a world that didn't understand what she had sacrificed in service to her country. Tonight, for the first time in years, she had been exactly who she was trained to be. As she reached the ground floor, Sarah could hear the ambulance and police sirens getting closer. She made her way quickly through the warehouse, avoiding the areas where the first responders would likely enter. By the time the EMTs reached the roof, she was already several blocks away, walking home through the rain as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something important. Sarah Martinez had been reminded of who she really was, beneath the tired exterior and the minimum wage job. She was a warrior who had spent 2 decades protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Tonight, she had done it again. And deep down, despite the violence and the death, it felt like coming home. The rain was starting to lighten as she turned onto her street. In a few hours, the local news would report on a tragic accident at an abandoned warehouse, where a young man had fallen to his death while trespassing with friends. There would be no mention of the middle-aged diner waitress who had reminded 5 criminals that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you least suspect. But in certain circles, in the places where predators gathered to plan their next victims, word would spread. A warning passed along in whispers. Be careful who you corner. Be careful who you threaten. Because you never know when you might be dealing with someone who has spent their entire adult life learning how to kill people more dangerous than you. Sarah unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, finally out of the rain. Tomorrow, she would go back to work at the diner, serving coffee and taking orders with a smile. She would be polite to rude customers and patient with difficult ones. But tonight had changed something fundamental. Tonight had reminded her that retirement from the SEALs didn't mean retirement from being a protector. It just meant being more selective about when and where to apply those skills. As she hung up her wet jacket and prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in her neighborhood. She was done hiding who she really was. 3 weeks after the incident at the warehouse, Sarah Martinez's life had settled into a new rhythm. The story of the accident had made local news for exactly 1 day before being forgotten. Just another tragedy in a city that saw too many of them. The police investigation had concluded quickly, with the surviving witnesses all corroborating the same story about drinking and poor judgment leading to a fatal slip on wet concrete. But in the neighborhood where Sarah lived and worked, things were changing in ways that most people couldn't quite put their finger on. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small grocery store on 5th Street, mentioned to her customers that she hadn't been bothered by shoplifters in weeks. The teenagers who used to loiter outside the liquor store had moved their hangout spot several blocks away. Drug deals that once happened openly on street corners had become more discreet, more hidden. Most remarkably, the string of muggings that had plagued the area for months had suddenly stopped. Sarah noticed the changes as she walked to and from work each day. She saw it in the way elderly residents no longer hurried past certain alleys, in the way mothers let their children play outside a little later, in the gradual return of normal neighborhood life to streets that had been surrendered to predators. Word had spread through the criminal network faster than she had expected. The story of what really happened that night had been told and retold, growing in the telling but never straying too far from the essential truth. There was someone in the neighborhood who was not to be trifled with, someone who looked harmless but possessed skills that had turned 5 armed men into 3 hospitalized victims and 1 corpse. The description varied depending on who was telling it. Sometimes she was a retired cop, sometimes a martial arts expert, sometimes just that crazy lady who threw a guy off a roof with her bare hands. But the message was always the same. Find somewhere else to commit your crimes. Sarah found the situation both satisfying and concerning. The reduction in local crime was exactly what she had hoped for, but she knew it was temporary unless she took more active steps. Fear was a powerful deterrent, but it faded if not occasionally reinforced. That's why she wasn't surprised when Tony Marconi approached her at the diner. Marconi was the kind of man who made his living in the grey areas between legal and illegal. He wasn't a street thug like the men she had encountered at the warehouse, but he was connected to people who employed street thugs. His businesses included a bail bonds office, a check cashing service, and several other enterprises that served the community's less law-abiding residents. He slid into a booth during the slow afternoon period, when the diner was mostly empty except for a few regulars nursing coffee and reading newspapers. "Sarah Martinez," he said as she approached with a coffee pot. "Mind if we have a chat?" Sarah filled his cup without changing expression. "About what, Mr. Bulk? Marconi? Please, call me Tony. And I think you know what about." Sarah set the coffee pot down and took the seat across from him. She had been expecting this conversation, or one like it, since the night at the warehouse. Men like Tony Marconi made it their business to know when the balance of power in their territory shifted. "I hear you've had some interesting experiences lately," Tony said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Define interesting. Tony smiled. 5 guys go up to a roof. One guy comes down the fast way, 3 more need medical attention, and the 5th, I can't stop shaking long enough to light a cigarette. Sarah sipped her own coffee. Sounds like they should be more careful around wet concrete. Sure. Accidents happen. Tony leaned back in the booth. But here's the thing, Sarah. Can I call you Sarah? She nodded. Here's the thing, Sarah. Since that accident, my business has been way down. People who used to come to me for certain services are suddenly finding religion, deciding they don't need those services anymore. My associates who work the streets are having to travel further to find suitable opportunities. That's unfortunate for you. Tony laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. You know what I think happened that night? I think 5 idiots tried to rob the wrong person. I think they picked on someone who turned out to have some very specialized training. Military training. Maybe. Sarah didn't respond, just continued sipping her coffee. Navy SEALs, Tony continued. That's what I'm hearing through the grapevine. 20-year veteran, multiple combat deployments, more confirmed kills than most people have Facebook friends. He leaned forward. The question is, what does a retired Navy SEAL want with my neighborhood? Sarah finally spoke. Maybe she just wants to get home from work without being hassled by criminals. Or maybe, Tony said, she's looking to set up her own operation. Maybe she figures she can muscle out the existing competition, become the new power in the area. Sarah laughed, and Tony was surprised by how genuine it sounded. Marconi, if I wanted to take over your business, we wouldn't be having this conversation over coffee. You'd already be gone. The casual confidence in her voice sent a chill down Tony's spine. He had dealt with tough guys his entire adult life. Men who had killed and would kill again, but there was something in Sarah's manner that was different. It wasn't the hot anger of street violence or the calculated cruelty of professional criminals. It was the cold competence of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions in situations where hesitation meant death. So what do you want? He asked. I want exactly what I said. I want to come and go without being bothered. I want the people in this neighborhood to be able to do the same. I want kids to be able to walk to school without dodging drug dealers. I want old people to feel safe going to the grocery store. Tony nodded slowly. That's very admirable. Very civic-minded. But business is business, Sarah. There's money to be made in this neighborhood, and people are going to make it, one way or another. Then, make it somewhere else. It's not that simple. I've got contracts, obligations, people depending on me for certain services. Sarah leaned forward. Let me explain something to you, Tony. I've spent the last 20 years dealing with people who thought their business was more important than other people's safety. I've hunted down terrorists who believed their cause justified killing innocent civilians. I've eliminated drug lords who thought their profit margins were worth destroying entire communities. Her voice remained conversational, but Tony could hear the steel underneath. The only difference between them and you is that they had the excuse of believing in something larger than themselves. You're just greedy. Tony felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Look, maybe we can work something out. Maybe I can redirect some operations, focus on other areas. That would be wise. But I need something in return. I can't just tell my associates that I'm backing down because some diner waitress asked me nicely. I need them to understand that there are consequences for not respecting the new arrangement. Sarah studied his face. What kind of consequences? Tony pulled out his phone and showed her a text message. 3 of my guys were planning to hit the electronics store on Maple Street tonight. They figure with all the weird stuff that's been happening lately, it's time to make a statement, show that we're still in charge. Sarah read the message, noting the time, location, and number of people involved. And maybe someone should be there to explain to them why that's a bad idea. Sarah handed the phone back. Why would you tell me this? Because I'm a businessman, Sarah. I adapt to changing circumstances. Right now, the circumstances in this neighborhood changed, and you're the reason why. I can either fight that change and probably lose, or I can work with it and find a way to benefit. What kind of benefit? Tony smiled for the first time since sitting down. Peace and quiet. A neighborhood where I can run my legitimate businesses without worrying about random violence scaring away customers. A place where the police don't feel the need to increase patrols because crime stats are going down instead of up. Sarah considered this. It wasn't the outcome she would have preferred, but it was realistic. Tony Marconi wasn't going anywhere, and trying to eliminate him would only create a power vacuum that might be filled by someone worse. The electronics store, she said finally. What time? 10 o'clock. 3 guys, probably armed, definitely not expecting any resistance. Sarah finished her coffee and stood up. Mr. Marconi, I think we understand each other. She walked away to help another customer, leaving Tony alone in the booth. He sat there for several more minutes, sipping his coffee and thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he had been a mid-level criminal entrepreneur with a comfortable territory and predictable income streams. Tonight, he was essentially hiring a retired Navy SEAL to handle his personnel problems. But as he looked around the diner, seeing the relaxed faces of customers who no longer worried about being robbed on their way home, Tony realized that maybe this change wasn't entirely bad for business. A peaceful neighborhood attracted better customers, customers with more money to spend on legitimate services. At 9:30 that night, Sarah changed out of her work uniform and put on dark clothing suitable for moving unseen through the city streets. She had spent the afternoon scouting the electronics store and the surrounding area, identifying potential approach routes, escape paths, and observation points. The store was located in a small strip mall that had seen better days. Half the storefronts were empty and the parking lot was poorly lit. It was exactly the kind of target that attracted opportunistic criminals. Valuable merchandise, minimal security, and little chance of witnesses. Sarah positioned herself in the shadows between two empty stores, with clear sight lines to both the front and rear entrances. At exactly 10 o'clock, a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot with its headlights off. 3 men got out of the car, moving with the nervous energy of people about to commit a crime. They were young, probably in their 20s, and dressed in the kind of casual street clothes that wouldn't attract attention during the day, but screamed criminal in this context. The leader carried a crowbar, while his 2 companions had baseball bats. They approached the store's front door with confidence born of experience. This clearly wasn't their first robbery. Sarah waited until they had forced the door open and disappeared inside before making her move. She crossed the parking lot silently, her footsteps making no sound on the asphalt. The store's alarm system was blaring, but she knew from her reconnaissance that the nearest police station was at least 10 minutes away, and they would probably take their time responding to what looked like a routine break-in. She entered through the same door the criminals had used, immediately moving to her left to avoid silhouetting herself against the streetlight outside. The store was small, with narrow aisles between displays of televisions, computers, and other electronics. She could hear the 3 men moving deeper into the store, probably heading for the high-value items in the back. Sarah drew her tactical knife and began moving through the store with the fluid precision of someone who had cleared buildings under hostile fire. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to minimize noise while maintaining tactical advantage. She found the first criminal in the computer section, stuffing laptops into a duffel bag. He was so focused on his task that he never saw her coming. Sarah's arm went around his throat from behind, applying pressure to the carotid arteries with surgical precision. He was unconscious in seconds, his body going limp in her arms. Sarah lowered him to the floor gently, then zip-tied his hands behind his back with restraints she had brought for exactly this purpose. She dragged him behind a display counter where he wouldn't be immediately visible. The second criminal was in the television section, trying to figure out how to remove a large flat screen from its wall mount. Sarah approached from his blind spot, timing her movement to coincide with the sound of his crowbar against the mounting bracket. This time she didn't bother with the chokehold. A single precise strike to the base of his skull dropped him instantly. She caught him as he fell and dragged him behind another counter, zip-tying his hands and feet. The third man, the leader, was in the back room where the store kept its most expensive merchandise. Sarah could hear him talking on his phone, probably coordinating with someone outside. "Yeah, we're almost done," he was saying. 5 more minutes and we'll be loaded up." Sarah stepped into the doorway behind him. "Actually, you're done now." The man spun around, his eyes wide with shock. The phone clattered to the floor as he raised his crowbar defensively. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "I'm the person who's going to explain why robbing stores in this neighborhood is a bad idea." He swung the crowbar in a wide arc, but Sarah had already moved inside his reach. Her elbow caught him in the solar plexus, doubling him over, and a knee to the face straightened him back up. The crowbar fell from his nerveless fingers as he staggered backward. Sarah grabbed him by the shirt and slammed him against the wall, hard enough to rattle the shelving units. "Listen carefully," she said, her face inches from his. "Tony Marconi sent you here to make a statement. Instead, you're going to deliver a different message. You're going to tell everyone you work with that this neighborhood is off limits. Anyone who wants to commit crimes here will have to deal with me personally." The man nodded frantically, blood streaming from his broken nose. "Good. Now, when the police get here, you're going to tell them that you and your friends decided to rob this store on your own initiative. You're not going to mention Tony's name or anyone else's name. You're just 3 idiots who thought they could make some easy money." She released him and stepped back. Your friends are zip-tied behind the counters out front. You can join them, or you can run. Either way, if I see you in this neighborhood again, our next conversation won't be nearly this friendly.
The man didn't hesitate.
He bolted for the back exit, leaving his unconscious companions behind. Sarah walked back through the store, checking on the two men she had subdued. Both were breathing normally and would wake up with nothing worse than headaches. She left them where they were and exited through the front door, just as police sirens became audible in the distance. By the time the first patrol car arrived, Sarah was 6 blocks away, walking home through the quiet streets of a neighborhood that was becoming safer every day. The next morning, Tony Marconi visited the diner again. This time, he didn't sit down. I hear there was some trouble at that electronics store last night, he said as Sarah poured his coffee to go. Really? I hadn't heard. Yeah. 2 guys arrested. 1 guy running around town telling everyone who listened that there's a ghost haunting the neighborhood. Taking down criminals single-handed, Sarah handed him his coffee. People have such active imaginations. Tony smiled and left a $20 tip on the counter. Sarah, I think this is the beginning of a very beneficial relationship. As he walked away, Sarah realized he was right. Not because she had any interest in being part of his criminal network, but because she had found her new mission in life. For 20 years, she had served her country by fighting its enemies abroad. Now she would serve her community by fighting its enemies at home. The tactics were different, the rules of engagement more complex, but the fundamental purpose was the same: protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah Martinez, retired Navy SEAL, was no longer retired. She was just getting started.